One.
Good afternoon and happy Monday. It is just after 12:15 on March 18th. We're here for a state legislation discussion. Before I turn it over to Ms. Wanger, did just want to note that Vice President Stewart is at a Smart Cities conference on an international trade mission with the county executive, so she won't be joining us today. And with that, it's crossover day today, so quite a big day in Annapolis. The purposes of today's conversation is we're going to get an update on the big ticket items that we have been closely monitoring and following. I'm going to suggest that we go through all of the updates and then open it up to questions and discussions. We'll talk about budget, taxes, housing, environment, health and human services, public safety, and juvenile justice. It loosely follows our state legislative priorities. And with that, let me turn it over to Ms. Wanger with thanks to you and your team for all the work that you've been doing on our behalf in the General Assembly in Annapolis. And with that, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's crossover today, so it's a it has been a busy weekend, and it's a busy Monday in Annapolis. So what is crossover? It means that if the House of Origin bills don't get passed to the other house by the end of today, then they end up assigned to the opposite house's Rules Committee, and that requires an additional procedural hurdle to get out and to actually be deliberated on by that opposite house. In fact, it's a pretty big hurdle, actually. I'm going to say that. In the olden days, it used to be a little easier to get those bills out of rules, but it's become, over the years, tougher and tougher. So it's an important day in Annapolis because we start to now really, first we get all the bills in, so we see what's before us, and now you get to see, I think, what's really in play and what's maybe not in play at this point with a couple weeks left in session. In your packet, I just want to run through what's here. There's an update on the local and bi-county bill package. And that is pretty current because I think that's pretty much settled out at this point. There's a status of all the bills that have been on an agenda that's come to council, and that was last updated like Friday afternoon. So more to come, hopefully tomorrow. I think we'll probably send another update on that. And then there's a listing of the local bond initiatives, which are starting to get worked on, and that list also shows where the county has been named as part of the financing package for those projects. We also have the list of earmarks in the first 6 appropriations bills from the vote that was taken last week on those first 6 bills. And then also tomorrow we're going to send out, a lot of you have been fairly active, sending letters in support or in opposition to pieces of legislation in Annapolis. And we've kind of kept track of all those, and we're going to send out to you where all those bills stand by tomorrow morning, which should, again, kind of be important information, so if they're moving or not moving. So we'll do that for you tomorrow along with a couple of other updates here. But otherwise, I'm going to kick it off, the budget. So last week, the Senate sent out its operating budget with the Budget Reconciliation Act. There's not a lot there, really. They had a couple of things happen to them. There was a revenue write-down, and also there was an inaccurate estimate of what the Medicaid expenses would be. So the Senate, I think if you read the newspapers, you probably has a different feeling than the House on how they're going to manage the budget and revenues this year. So they sent out a budget where they did some fixes. For example, the community colleges, they are getting back about $10 million in funding. The private higher education was hit hard. Some of that money's restored, and then they covered some of these kind of the two things that happened to them, which honestly the Medicaid underestimation was known, but it's a pretty big number. And then a slight revenue write-down. They have a volatility revenue account that they tapped for that, and then also are allowing the governor to use the rainy day fund to cover that Medicaid hit. So it's really a pretty standard budget going out there. The House budget is on the floor, I think, as we speak, probably. And they have a different approach to it because they are interested in Resolving part of their general fund problem largely involves the blueprint funding for the out years. And also they are interested in a larger fix to the transportation funding problems that were upfront and personal to all counties this past fall. So let's see, I think on the 26th, I just presented to you just a list, we didn't go through them, of all of the transportation bills that were out there. And at that time, we really didn't know a lot about the general fund side of things. So there's two pieces of legislation that are being moved by the House of Delegates on the general fund revenue side, which I call it that, and these are largely tagged to help finance the blueprint, which will run into trouble not this year, not next year, but in a couple of years. So they're looking to resolve some of these problems now. And that is an iGaming bill that will be that will be an item that would be on a referendum or petitioned. So it will require a vote of all the people in the November election if this piece of legislation does move and gets out of the Senate. And then another piece of legislation that was part of the Fair Share tax plan that received some attention, and that is the combined reporting piece out of that. Combined reporting is, addresses a multi-state issue about taxation. The piece of legislation has been in many, many, many years and has not passed. A lot of states do use combined reporting for multi-state corporations, and so the House has selected that as a piece of their tax plan, and that would not that would not be implemented until FY28. So both of these are kind of back-ended, but have a specific purpose. On the transportation side, the Train Commission did make recommendations in the fall about EVs, about registration fees, or ensuring that that those that have plug-ins or electric vehicles that are not paying gas tax or not paying gas taxes to the extent that others that have gas vehicles are would be responsible for some share of the costs of roads and everything else. So both the House and the Senate had pieces of legislation in on that. They both had toll legislation, and then as a separate note, they had shock trauma legislation since shock trauma was running out of money. So there's, the Senate's been pretty careful. I mean, they've done a piece of shock trauma legislation, they've done EV, they have not touched tolls, but the House has a lot of ideas on this front. They have a registration fee for large vehicles. They have a vehicle excise tax on trade-ins. That's something that went by the wayside probably about 10 years ago, where you were no longer taxed on the differential between your trade-in. You didn't pay the excise tax on that. They have that as part of their package. There's a vehicle excise tax increase from 6 to 6.5%. They also have a piece of trauma legislation. They have a tolling bill that would generate about $750 million that would be paid to the Transportation Trust Fund at $75 million a year for the next 10 years. After the Maryland Department of after the authority makes all of its payments, then it's to do this, which will require obviously an increase in tolls to pay for that. This one's near and dear to our hearts because we did have a local TNC piece of legislation in that you all supported. And instead, it looks like the House is moving a piece of TNC legislation. It's an impact fee. It's a 75-cent impact fee. So I will just say that does not look great for our smaller bill to increase the fee from 25 cents to 50 cents since they're taking the opportunity to tag on that one. There's increasing registration fees for electric vehicles, and that's kind of the package. I'm not certain if these are going to be individual bills that will move or if some of these will be included in the Budget Financing Reconciliation Act. So they're pretty far apart. So we'll see what happens in the next week or so. Discussions about how they're going to ultimately resolve these differences and put together a budget and a financing package. And that's budget. That's kind of the money side of things. And then, Leslie, you want to talk about housing?
Sure. So two of the three governor's bills in the governor's package for housing have moved. The tenants' rights bill is on third reader in the House today. That's the one that increases eviction filing fees and offers other protections like a tenant's bill of rights, establishes the Office of Tenant and Landlord Affairs and DHCD, et cetera. You've heard of that one before. The other one, the Maryland Community Investment Corporation, has also crossed over. And that one establishes a community development entity in the state that would allocate new market tax credits, typically subsidizing up to 20% of a project's capital costs. Those two have moved. The Housing Innovation Pilot Program and Fund has also moved, crossed over to the Senate. This would require a $5 million mandate in the budget each fiscal year, and the purpose of the fund would be to provide counties and housing authorities with low and no interest loans for to develop mixed use and cross-subsidized housing. So that one has also moved, as I said. Interestingly, there's a rental assistance for community schools families fund bill that has moved. It's on third reader in the House today. The Senate bill is crossed over. There's some slight differences, but essentially it takes the concept of a community school from the Kerwin bill and establishes a rental assistance fund for families who qualify for the fund. So for currently a community school has to have a concentration of poverty level of 65%. So if you are in one of those schools and then you otherwise are facing homelessness or housing instability, certain other criteria, you could then access rental assistance for up to 12 months from this fund. So the governor may include $10 million in the fund in the Senate version or an annual appropriation in the House version, and that's partially funded by the increased filing fees in the tenants' rights bill. Just an FYI, the Just Cause bill that has been in for many years has moved out of the House and is in the Senate. It's now called a Good Cause Termination Provision Bill, not Just Cause, but essentially it allows a county to adopt local legislation that would prohibit landlords of residential property of 6 or more units to prohibit them from failing to renew a lease during lease period or from terminating holdover tenancy without a good cause. So a change from previous years is that now it's landlords of 6 or more units in that county. I think that wraps it up for housing updates.
All right, good afternoon, folks. Garrett Fitzgerald with DEP. I'm happy to report a few significant energy and climate bills do seem to be moving this year. The bill that would take the Empower Maryland statewide energy savings program and focus it on climate and make it possible for folks to get incentives if they want to move from a gas furnace to a high efficiency heat pump in their home. That bill appears to be moving, which we've been working on for a couple of years very closely here. Multiple bills are moving that'll make it easier for folks who live in common ownership communities to install EV chargers. Multiple bills are moving that'll improve electricity system planning, which is very important for all the clean energy work that we're trying to do. We also expect SB 1 to pass, which will tighten regulations on retail energy suppliers to try to end some of the predatory practices that we see in that industry. And we asked for some amendments there to protect our community choice program, which were also accepted. So great to see all of those moving. One bill with potentially negative climate outcomes is SB 474, which is actually sponsored by the governor, and it would treat data centers as critical infrastructure and exempt them from certain forms of environmental review. These are very energy intensive facilities. Constrain the grid. They also tend to be built with backup diesel generators, a whole bank of backup generators, which can have localized air pollution, health, noise, etc. impacts. There was a really interesting discussion about this one, but the committee ultimately chose to not add amendments that could have required these facilities procure more renewable energy or go through more public process. I would expect we'll be talking about that one both in state and local policy quite a lot over the next couple of years. Unfortunately, SB 148, which we talked about last time, which would expand the state's flood mitigation grants program, has again this year been amended in the Senate to reduce the minimum amount of money that would be put into that program. Hopefully, will still be useful. We're still watching that one. The bigger story really this year is what isn't moving forward. You know, the Maryland Department of Environment spent all of last year writing a climate action plan for the state. And we really haven't seen a lot of major legislation moving that'll help make that a reality. It appears the RPS reform bill that would say that burning trash should no longer count as renewable energy will likely again not pass this year, despite we testified in favor of it again. Bills that are focused on requiring new buildings to meet their heat and hot water needs through electric technology, not burning fossil fuels, bills that would increase the pace of solar development, bills that would identify new forms of revenue to pay for some of the climate efforts. All of those appear to not be moving this year. We had one surprise last week. There was a bill, HB 1407, which was a bill that would require the Public Service Commission to establish solar targets for every county in the state, and would restrict us from using local authority to restrict or condition solar through zoning. That bill surprisingly did pass in committee at the end of last week, and then the very next day was withdrawn. So not sure the entire story about that just yet, but it's quite likely we will see legislation return looking at local authority to prohibit solar through zoning. That's going to come back for sure next year. To end on one bit of good news, the governor did announce $90 million of new funding. You might have seen this recently, and it was included in the budget. That'll fund building energy upgrades for community facilities, EV charging for LMI communities, some electric school buses. That's a good start. But on the whole, the story on the climate front is this is not a very ambitious year from a legislative standpoint. That's it for me.
Yeah. All right, just a couple of health and human services related bills to mention. The governor has his assisted outpatient treatment bill. It has moved out of the House and it's in the Senate. It's been amended so that if it enables a county to establish an assisted outpatient treatment program for anyone with a serious and persistent mental illness. However, if the county chooses not to establish their own program, the bill requires MDH to establish a program in that county. There are, little slight changes to the definition of mental illness under the bill, and it would still require the Office of Public Defender to provide representation in proceedings if someone contests their assisted outpatient treatment directive. And then the other to mention, related to opioids, I would say, is there's a bill coming out of the House, it was just heard in the House, last week, that would require local education authorities to have policies that authorize students and staff, et cetera, to possess naloxone on school property. So that bill, as I said, just had a hearing, no movement yet, but that is related to opioids. Otherwise, not much moving there.
Okay, Sarah Morningstar. Starting, I guess, with opioids, fentanyl. There's a fentanyl penalties bill that was heard, had a very strong hearing with support from several members of the council. It's crossover today. It has not moved at this point. Reckless and aggressive driving, which the county requested after the incident with Sergeant Kep. Also, two bills had a very strong hearing, both House and Senate. Has not moved, though I know there have been discussions on a number of amendments, so I'm not giving up hope yet. Vision Zero, a number of successes. There's a noise abatement monitoring systems program that has crossed Delegate Polakovich Carr to be able to have these systems in 3 counties in Maryland that would be allowed under that bill, and there are a number of other reporting requirements and the size of the penalty. Street racing and exhibition driving, also a bill is moving this year that would prohibit exhibition driving and strengthens penalties and points, something of importance to the county. Our delegation to local bills allowing speed cameras on high injury networks is moving, has crossed. Another local bill allowing the county to use speed cameras on roads with reduced speed limits after 1 year. Happy to see that moving. And finally, school bus cameras, a number of bills moving on the fine for school bus cameras. 2 bills are moving. The first would require Montgomery County at the specific locations getting high citations, the money that's collected there would go to State Highway Administration for improvements on state roads. We requested an amendment to enhance reporting requirements for State Highway, just to see where that's going. The other bill that's moving would give a warning for those violations on a 4 or more lane road with cars traveling in the opposite direction. Flew through the House last week, 9730. And then the other piece of public safety, I'll turn to my colleague, Kathleen Boucher.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll just mention that the juvenile law reform bills have passed both the House and Senate in different forms. So it remains to be seen how the House and Senate will work out those differences. I would say an interesting bill that has moved. This bill was actually cross-filed in the House and Senate. It has not moved in the House, but it has passed the Senate. It's a bill that would would increase the state sales tax, which is now 6%, up to 11% on firearms and ammunition, and then dedicate those funds to the state's shock trauma system, trauma physicians, and firearms intervention and prevention program, violence intervention and prevention programs. So I think those are the two that I would mention. Interestingly, on the housing situation, Leslie mentioned the first two governor's bills. The third bill, which dealt with preemption of local land use laws for supporting affordable housing, has not passed either the House or Senate. So it will not meet the crossover date, but it's our understanding that that's not supposed to indicate that it's in trouble. We've sort of been given an indication that it still will be supported by leadership in the House and Senate and make its way in some form before the end of session. So.
Can I jump back in? I skipped over the Health and Human Service bill.
Sure.
Just quickly mention, you've probably read in the newspaper, the access to care bills have passed both the House and Senate and crossed over. And this would allow folks who don't otherwise qualify for Medicaid or employer-sponsored insurance to enroll in health insurance through the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange. Just want to mention that as it's important to the county. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for that update. Colleagues, are there any questions or follow-up needed? Councilmember Mink.
Appreciate the updates. Exciting day. Could we add the Tenant Safety Act to the tenant bills that we're looking at if it makes it over? It's moved more than I think some folks had expected. So just wanted to keep an eye on whether the progress there continues, because that would be very helpful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Councilmember Ravernow.
Thank you so much. You may not have this at your disposal to follow up, but the task force that was looking at reducing emergency wait room times, with the possibility that there would be legislation to come with that, just curious as to where that stands.
So they have moved a bill out of both out of the House and Senate that formalizes that task force in legislation and gives it more time to make recommendations. So those bills are moving, and work will be continued. Yep.
Councilmember Lukey.
Just wanted to flag this because things were moving fast over the weekend, and it might not be something that was on folks' radar. Their Senate Bill 1145, it did have a cross-file, HB 1493. You can tell by the bill numbers they were introduced on the latter end of things, and so had late hearings. But Senate Bill 1145 did pass 45-0 on Friday, so it did. It will survive crossover, but it relates to prohibiting child sex offenders from attending school in person with potential victims. And I know it caused some consternation as it was being debated on Friday, not in the debate, but from people listening to the debate, because they maybe weren't as familiar with what it covered, but it is specifically related to children who have raped and or sexually assaulted, up to third-degree sexual assaults. And if you need the particulars of what that constitutes, you can look it up. It's in 3307 of the criminal law article, but it is beyond something where it might be like a passing touch that was, it's much more involved, much more significant, and much more disturbing. And so that did make it across to the House chamber.
Appreciate that. Any other colleagues? Okay, well, thank you.
Okay.
Less action here than in Annapolis, certainly on crossover day. Obviously, you're monitoring very closely what happens today, and really after today we'll have a better sense of what seems to be moving and what doesn't, and we'll keep apprised as to where things are. So thanks for continuing to keep us posted. As noted, colleagues, just a reminder, the positions we've taken are in the packet, as well as the federal earmarks and priorities, which is in there as well, which was discussed at a high level here previously, and then ultimately approved and sent over. And I'll just note on the community college funding front, as colleagues know, since you saw the county executive and I, on behalf of the county, sent a letter about that to the presiding officers, something that we have been very concerned about, and so we're pleased that's moving in a positive direction. So with that, thank you. Keep up the good work. Good luck over these final weeks here in the legislative session before sine die. And now we're going to move to closed council session. We're a bit ahead of schedule here, but we're going to vote to close session. So the council intends to meet in closed session, discuss the appointment, employment, assignment, promotion, discipline, demotion, compensation, removal, resignation, or performance evaluation of appointees, employees, or officials over whom it has jurisdiction. Under Maryland Code General Provisions, Article 3305, 1I. The topic is the appointment of an employee over whom the council has jurisdiction. Is there a motion? So moved by Councilmember Albornoz, seconded by Councilmember Lutke, and the council will, or those in favor of closing the session, please indicate by raising your hand. That is unanimous by all those present. We are now in closed session. The council will meet in the 4th floor Capitol Crescent Trail Conference Room. The open portion of the meeting is now closed.